Hello and welcome to Faith Informed, an Engage International podcast where we seek to clarify truth claims, challenge prevailing ideologies, and commend the faith. Joining me on the podcast today is Christian philosopher Dr. J.P. Moreland. Dr. Moreland is a distinguished professor of philosophy at Talbot School of Theology. He has spoken and debated on over 200 college campuses and taught in 500 or so churches around the world. In addition, he has authored, edited, or contributed papers to 95 books and published over 85 journal articles. Moreland was selected in August 2016 by the best schools as one of the 50 most influential living philosophers in the world. Dr. Moreland, it's so good to have you on the podcast today.
Well, Sam, my friend, it's always good to be with you, and I'm looking forward to our time together.
You and Hope have become dear friends to our family, and you continue to inspire me on many levels, both academically and personally. It was your class on metaphysics that was my first introduction to philosophy at Talbot. You helped me gain a deep appreciation for the field of philosophy, and I continue to learn so much from your work. So thanks so much.
Well, thank you. Oh, you're welcome. Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Today, I want to talk with you about the intersection of faith and science, particularly from a book you've written called Secularism and Scientism, which I would highly recommend to our listeners. Sit in any secular university in the world, and you'll be taught that there is a conflict between science and belief in God. It's essentially a battle where science has somehow made belief in God untenable. But this belief is not just limited to those in academic institutions, it's widely accepted. So, Dr. Moreland, my question as we begin this podcast is this idea that is so prevalent in our culture that science alone gives us knowledge. Often in conversations we hear phrases like follow the science or science tells us, or some other statement that emphasizes the authority of science. Science is seen as the ultimate and maybe even the only source of knowledge. Is it really the case, as is predominantly believed, that science alone gives us knowledge?
It's a very good question. And some issues, we can have pretty good reason to think they're not true. But there are other issues that we have absolutely knockdown, drag-out arguments that make it utterly false, without any doubt. And one case where that happens is if a claim is self-refuting. Now, let me give you an example. A statement is about a subject matter. So suppose I make the statement about all English sentences. My subject matter is all English sentences. It's not about dogs. It's not about French sentences. It's about all English sentences. Now, if a statement is about a subject matter and the statement itself is a part of its own subject matter, and if the statement doesn't satisfy its own criteria for truth and rationality, then it is self-refuting. For example, if I said no English sentence is longer than 3 words, well, that could be made false by a lot of sentences, but it's made false by that statement itself. If I were to say there is no truth, then that statement itself is being presented as a truth, and so on. Now, the statement that science alone gives us knowledge of reality is not a statement of science. You will not find that statement in a chemistry or geology book. There's no physical theory that demonstrates one way or another whether that's true. So it is not a statement of science. It's an assertion of philosophy about science. In particular, it's a statement in a sub-branch of philosophy known as epistemology. And so it is actually a philosophical statement that says that science is the only way to know reality. But of course, that statement doesn't live up to its own standards of acceptability because it is not itself a scientific assertion. And so by its own standards, the utterance itself would be false and irrational. So it cannot possibly be true. No amount of future discoveries of science is going to make this even more likely to be true because it's inherently contradictory. So there's no question that the assertion is like, archaeologists discovered square circles in Montana. I don't have to watch a TV show to look at the evidence for that claim. I know a priori, that is, before even looking at empirical evidence, that it's got to be false because it's in some way self-contradictory, and that's the same thing about this statement.
So, strong scientism, the view that the hard sciences like biology, chemistry, and physics are the only means of gaining knowledge, fails its own criteria, like you said, it's self-refuting. But there are those who do not subscribe to strong scientism. They may hold to weak scientism, a watered-down view that scientific knowledge is more valuable and authoritative. The natural sciences are the best sources of knowledge. So how would you respond to those who say that scientific knowledge is more reliable and the best means of gaining knowledge? Yes.
This is sometimes called weak scientism, and it is every bit as problematic as the strong scientism for two reasons. The first reason that this doesn't make any sense is that science is based upon a number of assumptions that are not themselves scientific. It makes assumptions that are, in order to clarify or defend or critique those assumptions, that's a philosophical task, not a scientific task. Now, an argument or a conclusion cannot be any stronger than the strength of its assumptions that undergird the conclusion. So the assumptions of science actually have to be known with greater certainty than the claim that science is the most superior way of knowing reality. And a number of those assumptions would be things like, what exactly is truth? There's no scientific test for that. What is knowledge? You claimed that this is the best knowledge we have. Okay, my question is, well, would you mind telling me what knowledge is? And please do so by giving me scientific tests in the lab or in some kind of way for your claim about knowledge. Well, the nature of truth and knowledge are being assumed by science, but they're philosophical matters, and postmodernists and others reject the very idea. So this has been criticized. It's widely rejected today, but the task of stating and defending these from criticism is a philosophical task. One other example. Science presupposes the truth of logic and mathematics. Now, science itself does not prove the truths of logic and mathematics because science is an a posteriori approach to the world. That is, it ultimately bases its laws of nature or other discoveries on empirical testing. Whereas logic and mathematics are a priori. That is to say that their truth value is known prior to any sensory experience, and the degree of certainty for them is greater than any claim in science. So the fact that it's necessarily true that if P then Q and P therefore Q is a little law called modus ponens. And the truths of math and logic are far greater, more certain than those of science, and science presupposes those. Now, don't confuse this with the claim that one particular geometry is the correct one for matching our current space-time world. That's a scientific question. But in terms of certain axiom systems and theorems and truths that follow from them, that's known with greater certainty than any claim in science. So science is based upon, and I could list in my book, Scientism and Secularism, I list, 10 or 12 of those. And they're widely known. And they're not scientific claims, they're philosophical claims. Now, one other thing on this. So the first reason is that it cannot justify its own assumptions, and its assumptions, which are philosophical, have to be stronger than the conclusion of weak scientism. So it's clearly not the case. The second thing is that there are things that we know outside of science with greater certainty than some of the things that we know in science. Not all of them, but there's a large group. So I was in the hospital. I'd had a cancer surgery, and I was in there for 9 days recovering. And I had several teams of nurses come. And one day, a new team of nurses came to me, and they were checking my vitals. And one nurse said, "Well, what do you do for a living?" And I said, "Well, that's an interesting question because I went to college and I actually had a fellowship to get a PhD in nuclear chemistry. So I studied chemistry and physics. But then later on, I developed a very strong interest and now in philosophy and theology, and now I'm a professor of philosophy." Well, she got a funny look on her face. And I said, "You're looking at me in a certain way, and I think I can read your body language. Tell me if this is what you're thinking." What you're thinking is, why would you leave fields like chemistry and physics where you can actually know and prove whether your theories are true or not, for fields like philosophy where it's just people sharing their opinions and having conversations? She said, "How in the world did you know that?" I said, "Well, I've been down this road before." And I said, "Well, did you know that there are things that we know in ethics with greater certainty and some of the claim that electrons exist?" And she said, "You're kidding me." And I said, "No, let me illustrate." I said, "Do you know the history of the electron?" "Well, no," she said. "Well, okay. If you look at the history of the electron, we have the J.J.C. Thomson electron, which was depicted, an atom had, I think it was 1,836 electrons in it, and they were embedded in the atom like raisins in plum pudding. They're just stationary, and they're stuck in the atom." There was the German wave theory, which treated the electron as a wave through the ether. So they presupposed the existence of the ether. Later on, you get the Bohr electron, which adheres to Newtonian laws of mechanics and motion. And then eventually this morphs into the quantum theory of the electron, which is more involved in wave functions and things like that. Now, I said, when you say you believe electrons exist, which are you talking about? The Thomson electron, the Bohr electron? You're probably talking about our current electrons. The quantum electron. Well, she said, "Yes, I suppose so." Well, but look, if you look at the history of the electron, older theories have been abandoned. We don't believe in the Bohr electron any longer. We don't believe in the Thomsonian electron. Now, could you, given the history of abandonment, wouldn't it be at least plausible that 50 years from now, we would find new information that would show that we should no longer believe in the quantum electron? Given the history, is that at least possible? She said, "Yeah, I could conceive of that." I said, "Okay, now consider the statement, torturing little babies for the fun of it is wrong." Now, you know it's wrong, and I know it's wrong, and so does everybody else. People who say that they don't know that's wrong need therapy, not an argument. This is common sense knowledge. Now, you may not know how you know it. I do, because I'm a philosopher and I've studied it, but that's not relevant. Whether you know how you know it or not, you know that. Now, can you imagine any new data or any new information that we could gain in the next 50 years that would all of a sudden make it, oh goodness gracious, I guess it is actually our moral duty to torture babies for the fun of it, or at least it's morally permissible. Now, I said I could conceive of society moving in that direction. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about them having good reasons to justify changing. And I said, no, you can't, because we have greater certainty in this ethical claim than we do that certain kinds of electrons exist. So I think that there are things outside of science that we know with greater certainty than some things in science. So knowledge is a multifaceted tunic, in summary. And how we know things should be tailored to the nature of the thing we're seeking to know. One size does not fit all.
Dr. Moreland, you rightly pointed out a number of features of the physical universe, such as morality and maybe even beauty, right, that are not the subject of scientific inquiry, and that they cannot be accounted for by the natural sciences. An idea that is so ingrained in our culture, you eloquently put it out there, that science, unlike religion, is based on assumptions. But you pointed out that science actually is based on certain assumptions, like there is objective truth out there. I also think there is this confusion surrounding faith. Faith is largely misunderstood in our culture as blind and irrational. To some, the notion of evidence-based faith is an oxymoron, right? But whether we see it or not, we all exercise faith in our day-to-day lives when we board an airplane, or open a bank account, or trust a friend with some sensitive information. So this whole notion of faith is antithetical to reason, is flawed, and must be rejected. Now, in your book, Scientism and Secularism, you list out several implications of scientism and how it has led to a number of shifts in our culture, particularly with respect to how we process reality. Would you please tell us what some of these implications of scientism are?
Well, Sam, you're putting your finger on the fact that this is not purely an academic discussion. It is that. But it has huge, huge implications for our lives and our well-being. If you accept scientism in either of its forms, then it will follow that the claims that are of most importance to us, like this, is there a God, and can we know what God is like? Do I have a soul, and is there life after death? Are there objective rights and wrongs that I was made to live under, and can I know what they are? Is there any meaning in life? And if so, how could there be such a thing? And what is it? Or is everything meaningless? Now, here's another one. What ought the state do in relationship to its responsibilities to its citizens? So when you're voting, you're assuming a view of what the state ought to look like. And you vote for candidates that will make it more that way. But none of those questions, they're all important questions, but none of them can be answered by any scientific laboratory test or any empirical investigation. So what that means is that all of these areas that are the most important. What is a marriage? Is there a sexual identity that we are born with that is tied to our biological identity? These are all of those questions have to be decided by either what you want to be true, so you just pick and choose what you want to believe because you like this belief but don't like that one, or by a blind faith where it's just how you feel. And the makeup man then becomes more important than the speechwriter, because it's impression, it's image that makes people sway one way or another, not careful thought. Now, the real definition of faith that is a Christian definition. People can have any definition they want, but if you're going to apply that to my Christianity, you need to. You're building a straw man. You need to represent me if you're going to criticize my views. You need to represent my views accurately. And I do not hold your view, if that's your view of faith. For me, faith is a confidence or trust in something we have reason to believe is true. And so faith is built upon reason, and it goes beyond reason, but it's grounded in reason. So, the reason that there's moral chaos in society is that we no longer think anyone can know what's right or wrong. And that's increased the number of people with anxiety and depression, because they don't believe any longer that there is a tried and time-tested true way for us to live that will make us flourish as human beings better than alternatives. It's a toss of a coin, which doesn't give a person any hope that there's a way out of their anxiety and depression. So these are some of the implications. There's been a change in our understanding of free will, because free will used to be the idea that you're free if you have the power to do what you ought to do. So I'm free to play the piano if I have worked hard and learned how to play it, and I'm able to do things with it according to the way it ought to be played. It has a nature to it. Regarding pornography, I'm free with respect to pornography if I can do what I ought to do, and that is to stay away from it. Today, freedom is the right to do anything you want. And that leads to all kinds of chaos, because I know in my life what I want is not always a very good guide to what is best for me. And so that has been a dramatic shift that's really have implications throughout our culture.
That's beautifully put, Dr. Moreland. As you were responding to that question, I was thinking, like, science is descriptive. It describes things. It is not prescriptive. And going back to your earlier point, that given scientism, moral knowledge is impossible. So the moral axiom we live by these days is live and behave any way you want, as long as you do not harm others. And I think it was Carl Truman who said ethics has become a function of feeling in our world today. Now, in our culture today, science and religion are pitted against each other. Many believe that science and faith are at odds. They are fundamentally incompatible. Science is rational, evidence-based, factual. It gives us knowledge. You alluded to some of these things in your responses earlier. It deals with reality, hard facts, and conclusions that could be proved to be true. Religion, on the other hand, is irrational, dogmatic, faith-based, superstitious, and subjective. Some, in fact, say that religion impedes the progress of science, and many of the proponents of this idea appeal to cases like Galileo's trial before the Inquisition. But they do so without properly understanding the nuances of the particular cases. That aside, so does belief in God impede the progress of science? Are science and faith at odds or incompatible?
Very good question. Yes. First of all, you have to remember that when I'm talking about Christianity, I'm not talking about religion. I'm talking about a particular set of ideas that allegedly happened in history. Now, I do think that most, if not all, most of the world's religions are based upon irrational blind faith. Buddhism in all of its forms, Hinduism in all of its forms. I think many, if not most of the forms of Islam are that way. But Christianity has never been like that from the very beginning. It spread through reasoning. All you have to do is read the book of Acts. You don't have to hold that Acts is scripture, but it is a legitimately reasonable historical source about the first 3 decades of Christianity, and they spread Christianity by persuasion and arguing that Jesus actually did the things that they're saying. So when it comes to Christianity is based upon a hard case for the existence of God and a hard case that the New Testament documents are historically reliable enough to know that Jesus performed miracles, what he taught, that he rose from the dead. We can know these things through historical methodology. So people who think this just need to get a life. And what I think they need to do is to start doing some reading. This is just a lazy slogan that people spout because they don't want to work hard, in my opinion. Start reading some books written by some of us who do believe the faith and represent us the way we really are, instead of building this fake view of what Christians are. Now, because a lot of Christians have blind faith, that doesn't mean that's what they ought to do. That may be saying more about their absorption of the culture. Now, Christianity in no way impedes science. In fact, it was in Protestant Europe where modern science originated in the soil of Protestant Christianity. Now, you may say, well, there was in China and other countries, there was the discovery of dynamite and other things. But the difference was that in the 1600s, what you had was theory making and hypothesis testing. And theories extending into other areas. And so the basis for almost all of these scientists was that there was a God who created the world so that it could be known, including known in its deep structure. That means the underlying laws that govern what we can observe on the surface, so that... And our minds were designed by this God so that they would be apt to know this world. And it was on that basis that they began to do empirical study, because they had this assumption that they would discover that some range of objects is law governed and it's reasonable. We can actually discover what some of those laws really are. And that, in fact, there's a value, an objective value that has to guide us. And that value is Occam's razor. It's the principle of what's called epistemic simplicity. And that makes sense if God exists, and it's a guiding principle. So Christianity, science flourished in a Christian culture. And many of the great scientists, including this very day, there are so many scientists in our universities and labs that are believing Christians. And they're believing Christians because of the evidence. They're not just because they were raised that way. The real conflict, as I see it, is between scientism and Christianity. And then the second conflict is with certain claims that some scientists make and the early chapters of the book of Genesis. In my opinion, 95% of the things that scientists think to be true have nothing to do with Christianity, and 95% of the theological truths have nothing to do with science. I mean, I don't know what it has why a chemist would be interested in whether Christ died for the elect or he died for everybody. By the same token, I don't care if a methane molecule has 4 hydrogen atoms or 15. Neither one's going to affect my rationality and what I believe as a Christian. 5% are in my view, are intention. Now, 3% of that 5% actually supports the existence of the Christian God. So science has been friendly to the existence of God and the reliability of the New Testament documents. there is about 2 to 3% of conflict, but none of those have to do with any statement in the great creeds of Christianity. They don't have anything to do with God's existence or the resurrection of Jesus. What they have to do with are issues in Genesis 1 through 11, and that might affect biblical inerrancy. And I'm not denying that these need to be solved, but you could grant that the scientists are right and the Bible is mythological. I don't grant that, but you could, for the sake of argument, grant that in the first 11 chapters of Genesis, and then say, well, but what in the world does that have to do with whether or not God exists and the truth of the core claims of Christianity? Nothing. So, I mean, I'm a big advocate of the full inerrancy of Scripture. And I take these issues about the first 11 chapters of Genesis to be important. But if I'm interacting with a skeptic and he wants to throw that at me, I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to grant you all that. The Bible is a good historical document, but it's not inerrant, for the sake of argument. Now, you tell me what that's got to do with whether or not there's a God and whether the New Testament is historically accurate. So I think those would be some things that I'd want to say about this myth of this inherent conflict between science and religion. Historians of science don't believe that any longer. It's been discarded.
It's really well worded, Dr. Moreland, that science arose in a rich Christian soil. And
the idea is embedded in that soil.
Correct me if I'm wrong. I think it was Rodney Stark, professor of sociology at Baylor University, who studied the top 60 scientists of the world in the 16th century. And he came to the conclusion that almost all of them were believers in God. Is that right? Do you remember that study?
It's not only right. Yes. Yes, it's not only right. Stark was an unbelievable sociologist. But it's not only right, but it's even more than that. That these scientists it wasn't just they were scientists and just happened to be Christians. It's that their science was based upon truths that they gained from their theology that made the scientific inquiry a rational activity. And that's the important thing about this study.
I can't help but think of the words of C.S. Lewis. He said, men became scientific because they expected laws in nature, and they expected laws in nature because they believed in a lawgiver.
That's right.
Now, there was one section of your book in particular that I really, really enjoyed. I mean, I loved reading your book, where you talk about science and religion as two different types of explanations. Would you please talk about the different explanations and how each is important and useful to account for different kinds of things?
Yes, absolutely. Before I do, I want to just make clear that I think that sometimes religion uses scientific kinds of explanations, and I think psychologists use what I'm going to call personal kind. So I want to grant that it's not that religion only uses one kind and science the other. They borrow from each kind, but there are two kinds of explanations that we all use every day, and so sometimes an alleged conflict between science and religion, not all the time, but sometimes it can be resolved by noting that Christianity is using one sort of explanation and science is using a different one. So a standard picture of how scientists explain things is called a covering law model of explanation, undergirded by an explanatory model. Now, let me explain. Suppose I want to know, I've got my pressure cooker, and I'm canning something, and the pressure cooker is at constant volume, but I notice that as the temperature elevates, the pressure elevates. How do I explain the fact that the pressure and the temperature at constant volume seem to rise or fall together. Well, now, I want to develop a law or discover a law that covers that fact, that makes that fact explainable. And so I come up with the ideal gas equation. Pressure times volume is equal to the number of moles of a gas times R, which is a constant, times the temperature in degrees Kelvin. So if the volume's the same, the PV is equal to nRT, that shows that N and R will be constant, that as the temperature increases, so what I've done, the pressure. So I've discovered a law that governs the way gases behave. But I still don't have an explanation for why this law governs gases. It's just a brute fact. So in order to get that, what I have to do is build a model that explains why the ideal gas equation applies to gases. And that will be the atomic theory of matter. And so I picture the container, my pressure cooker, as containing, when whatever I'm boiling is in the gas phase, little atoms that engage in elastic collisions. That means they don't lose any of their momentum or energy off each other and off the walls of the pressure cooker. Now, if you take pressure and you say that it's very carefully related to how many atoms hit a certain amount of the surface of the pressure cooker per second. And if you take temperature to be correlated with the mean kinetic energy, or the higher the temperature, the higher the kinetic energy in the atoms, the more that they are moving at a rapid speed and so on, then as the temperature gets up, you're going to have more that atoms hit the container wall per second, and pressure is more atoms hitting the container wall per second. So there you have a law that you've discovered, but it's why it applies is undergirded by some kind of a model. Now, that's a wonderful way of explaining, but that's not what we do in law courts or in most of life. So I come in and I see the table is set with a certain set of silverware. And I engage in what's called a personal explanation. I don't try to explain that by some law of nature or something like that. A personal explanation involves attributing to a person a motive and an intention. The motive is why they act, and the intent is what they're attempting to do. And I explain it by saying that this person had the ability and the opportunity to do this. And so a personal explanation involves all of those things. And so I would say that since we have neighbors that are Hispanic, and the table is set with margarita glasses and so on, and my wife, it had to be my wife, because my daughters are too young. They don't know how to do this. They don't have the ability. But my wife has the ability to set the table any way she wants to. And she could have the intent of setting a table that would be welcoming to our Hispanic neighbors. And her motive might be because she really cares about honoring them. And so a personal explanation involves appealing to the act of a person, their ability to perform it, their intent and their motive, things like that. That's what we do in a court of law. We don't use scientific explanations. We may use DNA as evidence, but the real explanation involves, does the evidence show the blood spatter was an accident or it was the result of an intentional act? Well, it shows that somebody murdered. This is intentional. This wasn't an accident that happened to the person. Do we have a motive? Yeah, there is a motive that we found. Well, is the defendant, did he have the ability to pull this off? And was he around, or was he 1,000 miles away? So that's that gives us truth and reasonable conclusions, and both are legitimate forms of explanation. So many times, natural theology and intelligent design will use a personal explanation if the evidence warrants it.
So we need both explanations to make sense of the physical world, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. We use them all the time.
Thanks so much for joining us on today's episode of Faith Informed. In the next episode, we will continue this conversation with Dr. J.P. Moreland on the relationship between science and theology. Does science contradict Scripture, or does it in fact confirm the teachings of Scripture? And how atheistic naturalism fails to adequately account for human reason. If you enjoyed today's episode of Faith Informed, please like, share, and subscribe. If you're listening on any of the podcast platforms out there, please leave a review. I look forward to seeing you next time, right here on Faith Informed.